Hello, welcome to Mary's Pence Illuminating Conversations podcast. Our Illuminating Conversations series highlights select books from our annual summer reading list. The books represent a diverse collection of voices and perspectives that highlight social, environmental, and spiritual themes. By reading these books and discussing them as part of our monthly Illuminating Conversations series, we can all play an active part in the ongoing work to understand and ensure dignity, justice, and solidarity for all. For this episode, we met with Dr. Artika Tyner, founder and executive director of the recent Mary's Pence grantee Planting People, Growing Justice Leadership Institute in St. Paul, Minnesota. We discussed her children's book, Justice Makes a Difference, the story of Miss Freedom Fighter Esquire.
I'm Catherine Voiton, and I'm Executive Director of Mary's Pence, and I'm so glad to welcome you tonight to this conversation with Dr. Tyner. Dr. Tyner runs an organization that is a Mary's Pence grantee called Planting People, Growing Justice, and I know she'll tell us a bit about that work as well as the many other things she does in this world about justice. So I'll say a couple words about Mary's Pence. Mary's Pence is a nonprofit organization that supports and funds women in North America and Central America. And we do that in two ways. In North America, we fund small local grassroots organizations that are women and really community focused and doing justice in their community. So creating a more just community. And we do that across the United States. So we have grantees across the United States. And Dr. Artika and Planting People and Growing Justice is one of those. And the only requirement is that it has to be women-focused and women-led. It has to be really from the community, involving the community, and it has to work on long-term social change that's good for people. In the other way we do support women is through our Aspira program, and that's how we work in Central America and Mexico. We have 10 partners in Central America and Mexico that are all women's groups locally organized in the communities, and we support them in many ways. And the key way we support them is through helping create skill sets that allow women to earn an income in their communities. And it's mostly informal sector jobs. So women growing vegetables and animals, doing small shops, some artisan crafts, things like that. So we really strongly partner with existing groups, and we have a long-term relationship with them in Central America. We also help them with some emotional wellness workshops and some strengthening of the local women's organizations. We embarked on a leadership training with a group of 17 women that went throughout the year, and it's going really well. So that's a little bit about Mary's Pence. We are a nonprofit and we are donor supported. So we're grateful to all the donors that showed up here today, as well as people new to Mary's Pence. So Dr. Tyner, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself and start the discussion.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. It's wonderful to be in community with each and every one of you. I feel quite blessed to have been a recipient of the Mary's Pence grant. It allowed us to create a program called Women Leading Change to provide women with the tools that we need to engage in public policy advocacy and to advance social justice. In particular, is very personal to me. After the murder of Mr. Floyd, one of the things that my mother kept saying that was ringing in her ears, that he was calling out for his mother. And she knew all these years that I was a civil rights attorney doing a lot of work around criminal justice and education. She normally would just say, keep going. But that was her first time really making a direct plea and ask to make sure that we were providing the type of tools for everyday mothers to lead their own change in real time, the change that required. So some of the women that we got organized, they went to the legislature. As we were looking at policing reform, public safety reform, they lifted their voices. They got involved in the process in ways that they had not before. I just saw one of our participants yesterday, and she talked about how powerful it was to learn about some of the timely social justice issues. For instance, she was able to help out because one of our speakers, the lecture focused on identifying, so preventing and intervening when we see human trafficking. So she was able to help to report and help to bring forth an intervention in real time around labor trafficking. These are just a couple of examples, but really the point of my work has always been that simple piece that community organizers oftentimes talk about: got voice, got power. And for women, I think it's very important. We talk about being half the sky. We talk about being organized and being connected and around women's issues. But in many ways, we still have to move from talking to action. And my hope is that the programming that we have, we use an intergenerational approach. So we're interacting with, we're motivating and inspiring the whole family. So that was one of our examples with working with mothers, but we know the ripple effect that then will impact their children, impact the community, and the broader society. Planting People Growing Justice became a 501c3 in 2017, but we were established in 2014. We were responding directly to one specific issue initially, and that was related to literacy gaps. In fact, I'm seated in this chair, but this chair is really holding me together. Today, I organize and help to deliver 400 books here for St. Paul Public Schools, and it was a mighty feat, but in the end, well worth it, because we know that if we can address literacy directly, we are creating and opening windows of opportunity for all children. So our mission, we started with a general mission in the sense of planting seeds of social change through education, through community engagement, and also, of course, through our training around leadership development. And that's where our relationship with Mary's Pence originated. But the reality of it is, we know oftentimes we have that mantra that the sea is so wide and my boat is so small. By the time we start addressing one issue, we continue to notice that there's so many more. So one of our core programs, so of course we then have the leadership program, Women Leading Change. We also have a writing program where we write and publish books, because a part of our work and our own vision is not only just to promote literacy, but to promote diversity in books. When less than 10% of books are written by someone from a diverse background, and in addition to that, less than 10% of books have a main character of color, we know that there's work to be done. So I'm giving this as an invitation. If you go to our website, which is ppgjli.org, that's ppgjli.org, there are a number of different writing competitions and other opportunities for the community to help shape and write their own stories about their narrative. So we give that invitation, share it with your schools, share it with others in your community, because it's critically important for us to have those opportunities to help the community write their stories, be their own storytellers, and shape their own destinies. So last but not least, of course, is our work around literacy. Where we're seated today, we're in a crisis that not many people talk about. When 1 in 4 American children cannot read at grade level, there's some harsh realities that are coupled with that. When you are not reading at grade level by 3rd grade, I know oftentimes they talk about this, but this is just general information based upon correlation, that you could use those 3rd grade reading scores to project the prison population 10 years out. And why are they using that as an image? Some people say it's a myth, but the reality of it is there is a correlation between illiteracy and future incarceration. 85% of the young people who are currently incarcerated in juvenile justice facilities are functionally illiterate. 60 to 80% of the adult population. Now let's take that data where I started, that 1 in 4 children are not reading at grade level by 4th grade. If you're not reading at grade level by 4th grade, you're 4 times more likely to drop out of school. If you drop out of school, you're 3.5 times more likely to be incarcerated in your lifetime. Just hearing that data gives us a sense there are some tangible things that we can do to address the challenges around criminal justice. Why does this matter for me? Before I earned my doctorate, before I earned my master's in public policy, I was an attorney, still am today, a civil rights attorney. So I focused on criminal justice and education issues. So it came alive to me to think very strategically on how I can make an impact in real time. And once again, it was personal for me because many of my clients learn how to read in prison. And you may think, okay, at least they learned how to read. No, if we're talking about justice, access to justice, and fairness, I sure hope you should be able to read your indictment. I sure hope that you should be able to read the evidence that's being presented against you in court. And I'll make it personal for a moment because there's one client that I will carry with me the rest of my life who has a prison sentence of life without parole. And I am convinced with certainty that if my client knew how to read, my client would have been able to advocate on their own behalf to be able to fight the case that was against them. So why does this matter to me? Because the nonprofit that I created was in direct response to all of the challenges that I had as a civil rights attorney, knowing that 2 places I faced great challenges. It wasn't just one client, it was multiple clients. But the other place, the second place that I faced great challenges was, if you know anything about me, I come from a family of preachers and educators. So with that being said, for the educators, of course they knew. I mean, I think I was educating, going to school with my Barbie dolls, teaching each other, and my Cabbage Patch Kids. It was just coming naturally. It was all I wanted to do. But the reality of it was that when I went into student teaching, all those data points that I just mentioned, I saw them firsthand. And that's when I made the determination to become an attorney, because I believe the law is a language of power. And I was convinced if we could become more well-versed and that we being me in that language, I could be more impactful in my community. So here it is, to go full circle. I didn't leave all those experiences behind, whether it's my clients who were in prison, whether it's the school children that I saw that in kindergarten didn't have a basic understanding of phonics or even able to identify some of the letters on the board when we were trying to do our ABCs. I knew that there was something that I could do. So with what I would like to call my sword, my law degree, and of course, my shield, for me, of course, is my faith, we brought it all together and decided to be impactful. And that was the beginning of what we call today Planting People, Growing Justice Leadership Institute, bringing all those themes together, making an impact around criminal justice. When America only has 5% of the world's population and nearly a quarter of the world's prison population, we know we have work to do. When the average cost of incarceration exceeds $30,000 in many states is upwards to $60,000, and we struggle to make sure schools' basic needs were met, we knew that there was work to do. So in my very own living room, the same house that I'm sitting in today, I brought together a group of friends. And out of that came something very specific. They said, okay, you talked about all these things, so what can we do? And we decided, and we actually won the 2020 inaugural Community Creates Award in Minnesota through the Minnesota Author Project in our local libraries for a book called Justice Makes a Difference, the story of Miss Freedom Fighter Esquire. We came together to write a story of a young girl who decided to be that superhero for justice. She decided to take a stand and grapple with the question that many of us do. Am I too young to make a difference? Am I too old to make a difference? Am I too inexperienced to make a difference? Fill in the blank, whatever excuse we try to give. The main character of our book, Justice, decides to move into the mode of action in real time. So Justice Makes a Difference. Of course, I was just at Nokomis School yesterday evening. And one of the things the young people said, well, I gave them a chance to ask some questions. Justice looks familiar. So I said, how so? And one young person said, well, Justice looks just like you. And I said, you're just about right. Because Justice, the character's likeness, is from my Citizen of the Week photo. So when I was about 8 years old, I consistently was winning Citizen of the Week. Fast forward to today, it might explain who I am. It gives you a sense that I've always been committed in asking those questions on how we can bring forth change. Now, of course, my mother, I think she may have been close to a patron saint. She would just say, hush, child. She was so kind about it. So when I was growing up, I thought Hush Child was my name. Hush, and then Child was the last name, of course, because that's how frequently she had to say it. Because I was always raising questions about every injustice that I saw. Fast forward to today, oftentimes we don't talk about it, but your gifts will make room for you. Oftentimes we're just like, what's going on with this child? But you might be discovering their purpose and their destiny, even while they're young. So for me, that Hush Child gave me a sense as I became an adult to really use my voice and lift it for justice wherever I am. So here it is. Justice Makes a Difference. I'm going to read you a few of the pages, introduce the plot, the characters, and give you more of the background on why I decided to write the book. And then, of course, we'll be going into our breakout sessions discussing some of the broader themes more, because I covered a lot, from criminal justice to education to leadership development to Mr. Floyd. We covered a lot of ground in just the initial few moments. But I also think it's important to move beyond the statistics and the data to really talk about how we manifest change. And that sense that Justin finds out about of what is in our hands to make a difference in the world, really that action and that challenge to be impactful. So here it is. Justice Makes a Difference, the story of Miss Freedom Fighter Esquire. Justice's favorite place to visit was her grandma's house. Grandma always greeted her with the biggest, warmest hug. Grandma always made Justice feel important. So if you're getting a hint, of course, if Justice is me, this is my real grandmother, my grandmother, Nellie Lightfoot. And my grandmother, she passed away when I was in junior high school. But the legacy and the imprint that she put on my heart and in my spirit, I feel her with me every day. So my grandma Nellie, just a little background and context, she may have been the woman that would tell you that she never wanted to be called a leader. She probably was the woman who never wanted her name mentioned in the room, but she impacted every person in every room that she went into. But more importantly, she was a woman that went without position or title, and oftentimes we associate that with leadership. But she understood that leadership was really about cultivating her faith, being a steward of the gifts and talents that she had and the resources, and being impactful wherever she was. So my grandmother came from very humble beginnings. We would call her today the housekeeper, the help, the maid, or domestic. My grandmother, probably on her greatest days of wealth creation and earning, earned $20 to $40 a day and worked from sun up to sundown. She came from the fields of Alabama and experienced in many ways the reality of Jim Crow. She came from a sharecropping family in Alabama. So she taught me the early lessons of hard work, dedication, and perseverance. So oftentimes we see it as a hashtag that I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams, but I'm just that. Despite many of the challenges that she faced as she came north and migrated north, she helped. And this is something that really stood out to me as I learned more about her story. My grandmother helped to move our entire family north from Alabama, one by one, two by two, as she continued to save until she had enough money to get us all here. Because in many ways, and I'll just tell you a bit of our story as a family, we are from the Rondo community. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Rondo, but I had to write a story about Rondo so we could not ever be forgotten. So I have also a book called Joey and Grandpa Johnson's Day in Rondo. And if you don't know anything about Rondo, Rondo is the link across Minnesota, and especially the Twin Cities, because in 1956, a measure of progress was new highways and interstates. But the reality of it was what happened instead was displacement, destruction, and loss of wealth, primarily in African American communities, because the interstates and the freeways tended to go right through the heart of our communities. And that meant, and this is another reason why I became an attorney, that overnight African Americans, their dreams of building wealth were lost, because with eminent domain, they lost their homes. And I know eminent domain by law, you would say you're supposed to get the fair market value, but we know still today, because there's a lawsuit emerging as we're talking right now, that a particular home in California, an African American family, when they lived there, had their photos up, had their artifacts in their home, it was worth $500,000 less than when they turned around, took out everything that would identify them as an African American family. Why am I bringing up these issues? Because we love to say all the racial injustices were so long ago. But the reality of it is, for even my own family, I can take you back to the chains of slavery in less than 3 generations. I think we have to sit with this and grapple with this. So as we think about history, we can't think about history without acknowledging where we have been and where we need to go in real time. So our Rondo story, many would say, then are you giving us a story of defeat? That at the peak, we had over 400 businesses in our Rondo community that were Black owned. Today, we have less than a dozen. That's not a story of defeat. It is a story of a setback. But the reality of it is, in becoming a civil rights attorney, one of the pieces that I'm constantly working on is related to economic justice and racial justice right in our community here in Rondo. And the best part is, my friends, not in isolation, also in collaboration with, there are nearly 1,000 documented cases of racial removal across the nation that is associated with our interstate freeway systems. So I work in partnership with communities all the way from Florida, the Gullah Geechee Nation, all the way across the nation to make sure that we are advocating for the rights of our people, the protection of our land, and the resources to preserve our community. So since we're talking about books, I would have been remiss without talking about Joey and Grandpa Johnson's Day in Rondo. And additionally, I was also interviewed for PBS NewsHour about Rondo and the future of land and the impact. So please feel free. You can find the video and the reporting on that topic of what is the future of land, highways, and the interstates as it relates to our new infrastructure. Back then it was a bill, but related to the infrastructure law. So back to my grandmother. Why is it important? Because in one particular scene in the book, I talk about this, that my grandmother primarily spent most of her time in the Rondo community. And did she miss opportunities to see the rest of the world? It's kind of one of the questions that we begin to explore through the lens of the young justice. But let's get back to the text to find out more about how Justice learned some important lessons from her grandmother. And by the way, the yellow house is not a mistake. My grandmother's house was yellow. So if you're driving down Olson Memorial Highway, that big yellow house in the corner was my grandmother's home. So the best part of Grandma's house was her den full of books. Justice and Grandma would spend hours together in the den, talking and reading. Your name is your destiny, Grandma had been telling Justice since the day she was born. Grandma reminded her often that being named Justice came with great responsibility. To whom much is given, much is accounted for, Grandma always said. Justice might not have understood all the words that Grandma said, but she understood that she was to serve and lead in the community. So this was my favorite place in my grandmother's house, her den full of books. And in fact, despite what I said about my grandmother having very humble beginnings and a meager income, she always made the investment in my education and she always bought me books. So this is why we have this theme. So one day when Justice was visiting, Grandma asked, "What is in your hands to make a difference in the world?" "What can I do?" Justice wondered. "I'm only 8 years old. How can I make a difference?" Grandma served in the church. She fed the hungry, sheltered the homeless, clothed those in need, and visited the sick. Grandma described this as living out her faith. Justice wanted to be like her grandma. She wanted to know how she could live out her faith. And of course, this illustration is of serving in a kitchen, because oftentimes in many of the churches where my grandmother was a member, you could find her in the kitchen every Sunday making a delicious meal for everyone else. I'll give just one of the profiles for our reading today, and I hope you get a chance to read the rest of the book, but this will be an important one. I'll share about Ida B. Wells. Now, we know Ida B. Wells, of course, as a part of the suffrage movement. We know her as a great writer, but let's see what else we can learn about her in this short piece. Grandma found Justice in the den, heavy with thought. "Tell me what's bothering you, Justice," Grandma said. "I want to live out my faith like you, Grandma. But I'm only 8 years old," Justice said. "What can I do? Aren't I too young?" Grandma's smile was gentle and reassuring. "Your age does not show what you are capable of. So don't let someone tell you that you're too young to make a difference." "Justice, do you remember the poem you wrote for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. celebration at your school?" Grandma asked. That poem made a difference. Justice remembered the applause of her teachers and classmates. She knew her grandma's words were true. Grandma gave Justice a book. Here's a book about someone else who made a difference through her writing. Justice spent the rest of the afternoon reading about Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a journalist who used her writing to advance racial equality. She skillfully wielded her pen to wage war for justice through her work as editor of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight. She continued to advance social change while serving as a journalist with Chicago's Daily Inter-Ocean and the Chicago Conservator, one of the oldest African-American newspapers in the United States. Justice was amazed by how Ida B. Wells used her pen to write for justice. Justice picked up a pen and said, I can write for justice. So why is it important of the method that I used to write this book? I wanted to make sure that I was introducing those civil rights heroes and sheroes that inspired me, but also those unsung heroes that we don't talk about. For instance, Ida B. Wells, yes, she's gotten additional attention because she did, although she didn't live to see it, her granddaughter was able to make sure she received the acknowledgement that she was due as a Pulitzer winner. And when I think about that, it meant a lot because she wrote a piece that most people have never heard of. And it's called The Red Record. The Red Record. Without writing The Red Record, we would have been missing a vital part of history. The Red Record documented the history of racial lynching and terrorism in America. Her work helped to shape our understanding of many of the challenges that African Americans faced and still face today. So through her advocacy, through that decision to pick up that pen and write for justice, she gave voice to many people that didn't have a voice to advocate for not only racial justice, but to protect their very own lives. And in addition, and this was just a new revelation for me because I was working on a book, I knew she was a suffragist, but I didn't know some of the real challenges that she faced because I had a lot of misconceptions about the 19th Amendment and the process in bringing it forth. I had no idea that Ida B. Wells, despite the fact that she was organizing women, and here's something interesting, one of the other grantees is the League of Women Voters, so we've had some great conversations about this. And one of the things that she was able to do very early on, we don't talk about this, we talk about women only voting in federal or national elections. There were a group of African American women that organized voting in the early 1900s in certain cities throughout the state of Illinois. And I got a hunch, Ida B. Wells was a part of that advocacy. But despite that, and many of the things that she fought for equal rights for all women, the color of her skin served as a barrier because even within the suffrage movement, she was oftentimes excluded from marches or asked to march in the back of the line. So although we made these advancements around the 19th Amendment, we know it takes us all the way into the 1960s, going into 1965, for women of color to really have access to the ballot box. And you may be thinking, Dr. Tyner, why are you bringing all this up? Because this is why we created the program called Women Leading Change, to have these educational moments of how women can get organized, no matter their race, background, or creed. How do we come together in strategic ways under one umbrella, under one identity, around our gender? But at the same time, I'm going to introduce a concept to you as well called targeted universalism. One of my dissertation participants coined this term. His name is John A. Powell. If you don't know him in Minnesota, he's legendary because he helped to create the Center on Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota. And now he's at Berkeley doing similar programming around racial justice. But targeted universalism would tell us that yes, women's rights overall, universal for all women. But the targeted piece is how we help to ensure that we're taking the type of narrowly tailored approaches to make sure, if we're talking about women and all women, that we're addressing the particular challenges that certain groups of women face in real time. So in using targeted universalism, we can help to identify challenges. This piece that I oftentimes teach my students, we see a problem, we create a solution. But I sure hope that we can, when we see a problem, take a very deliberate, actionable approach in collaboration to deal with the nuances of many of the challenges that we face. So although women like Mary Church Terrell, a long list of Black women, and that's just Black women that I'm listing because of my cultural history, what about Indigenous women? What about Native women? What about Asian American women? All fought for the 19th Amendment, but still did not have access to the ballot box in 1919. I think there's something to be said for that. So here it is, fast forward to today in 2021, we have some questions. And the book is the invitation to learn about these heroes and sheroes that decided to take a stand and decided to make a difference. So I'll pause here. You got an introduction to one chapter of the book, but I hope you'll continue on and learn about everyone else. One theory that I want to make sure that we introduce, there's a theory that's in the children's book literature world called mirrors and windows. And the whole purpose of thinking about this was coined by Dr. Sims Bishop, was this idea of what does it mean to have representation in books. So the mirrors, you all talked about it, the sense of being able to see a reflection of yourself. Literally, the greatest compliment that I received about the Justice book was from a gentleman that I met during a TV interview. His name was Justice. So he had two small children. So I made sure I gave him copies for his children. And he sent a message back and he said, my daughter loved it. And notice what she said. She said, Daddy, it's me. Daddy is me on the cover of the book. So the power of having those mirrors is a positive representation. I'm currently working on some STEM projects. And one of the things is I work on the curriculum and all the different pieces of building a STEM academy. A big piece of it is that mirrors, to have that representation, because I worked in science education along with Grace for a number of years. But the challenge, and we can attest to it based upon the data, but just based upon what we actually saw, after a while, the interest tapered or dropped because of the challenge of seeing a lack of representation, potentially even within the classroom, in the sciences and math. I can attest to it myself. I would have loved to lean more into a STEM career, but not seeing representation on gender and race, I must admit, it just didn't seem practical any longer as I grew older and didn't seem accessible. So those mirrors are important. But coupled with that is also the importance of windows, that all children see into the cultural experiences of other children. And why is this important? In many ways, with the political rhetoric and everything we hear in our day-to-day lives, many people fear what I'm going to say. But I'm going to tell us and challenge us to look at it maybe in a different way. And when I say tell us, I mean raise a question. Will we meet this statement with fear or with faith? And here it is. America has changed. It's not Bob Dylan, times are changing. I'm sitting here in St. Paul, which has now become a majority minority city, which the language, that's a whole nother thing. It makes zero sense to me. But the reality of it is, what does that really mean? For me, it means that I lean in faith and say, that means we have a rich tapestry. That means that we have an opportunity to learn, we have an opportunity to boost our local economy through the vibrancy of new businesses. Where I sit today, I'm in the heart of Little Mekong, meaning an Asian American business district, while also sitting in the middle of Little Africa, a representation of the African diaspora. For me, I think I'm in the best part of the city to be able to have access to food, to culture, small businesses, all in a few block radius. But yet there are many people in our community that fear that, feel like it's something that's unknown and taking away from something from someone else. And still yet, and let's talk about children as it relates to representation in books. Let's talk squarely about children. In 2019, we already had the data that the vast majority of new births in America would be children of color. We know based upon the data, even looking at before we got to the 2020 census, in 2010, we could have predicted that America was going to do two things. We were going to brown and age. Once again, are you going to meet that with fear or faith? I mean, I've chosen faith and the power of innovation and the power of culture and community building. So my books are introduction to all of those themes. So it's not just about representation for children of color or BIPOC children, however you define it. This is a blessing and a gift to all children in real time.
I want to take this time to open things up, I think, just to questions for you, Dr. Tyner. And I also want to mention one of the other things that you and I had talked about prior to tonight was just about civic engagement. And so developing leaders to become involved as active citizens. So I guess one of my questions for you and for others, if they have comment, is about some of your work in helping women, particularly young women of color, become actively engaged in their local community. And so if you could talk a little bit about your work to do that, and if you think there are things that others like ourselves on this call could be doing to also either participate or help empower others to be part of that civic engagement.
Of course, civic engagement is near and dear to my heart. I launched an initiative called Leaders Journey 365 that was a part of the curriculum that we use for women leading change. I wanted us to have clarity of purpose, that civic engagement did not just end on a Tuesday at the ballot box, but in fact, it was a commitment each and every day in real time, in real practice, to make sure that the ballot box for many people, that was their starting point around civic engagement. But in addition to that, still thinking about what are the ways when we go to the state capitol or even to the capital of the United States in Washington, D.C., remembering that it's the people's house. It means it's your house. How do you engage your elected officials after the elections? How do you help to set a policy agenda? How do you help to bring together that collective power around community organizing? Because Saul Alinsky, many call him one of the forefathers of community organizing. In his book, Rules for Radical, one of the things that he said, if you got only 2% of the nation's population organized, they can overthrow the government. Now, once again, some people say, oh, that's fear. But he was talking about it through the lens of faith, and the sense of faith in humanity, that if people came together, they could help to set the type of agenda or vision for our shared humanity and common destiny. So for me, when I think about civic engagement, it is an invitation that we should be extending to everyone. Based upon the data from the League of Women Voters, we know, for instance, that women tend not to ever run for office, or in my research related to leadership development and looking at some of those studies, to take on a leadership role unless they're invited. Here's your invitation. Get involved. Give that invitation to other women. Do not wait. What does waiting mean? Governor Dayton appointed me to his Young Women's Council. I served on the council for his whole term. And one of the things that stood out to me related to that work was how many things I didn't know about the challenges facing women. And then that targeted universalism. Don't get me going on the specifics of impact on women of color. But let's just say women as a whole. We know then that it would take all the way to the year of 2059, and this is pre-COVID. These numbers have changed and they haven't gotten better, because women at the peak of COVID face some of the highest rates of unemployment in the nation across any demographic group. So we know then before COVID, it was by 2059 to get pay parity, that women would get equal pay. We know then the reality of it is many of the disparities and challenges that we face right now will take even longer than that. In addition to that, because women fail to negotiate their salaries, we lose on the average of $1 million during our lifetime for failure to negotiate for our salaries. So when I think about that, that's just two quick examples that we talked about in the Young Women's Initiative. It gives us all a challenge to take that younger woman in your circle, mentor, support, elevate her profile. It takes us to then go to our organizations. I recently wrote a book called The Inclusive Leader, Taking Intentional Action for Justice and Equity. Everyone tells you they want diversity. Everyone tells you they want inclusion. I ask one simple question of all of my friends that are CEOs from Fortune 500 companies and beyond, even in smaller firms, smaller nonprofits. I ask them one simple question, and they never call me back after I ask them this question. If you're committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, if you're committed to justice, do one thing for me. Give us pay parity. You'll never get a call back, because that's something that we could solve today through human resources. I just watched the hiring process and I said, this is a shame. You got to choose who you wanted to hire. So you didn't even have parity in the hiring process. And then the individual they chose, and notice this particular example, gender's a piece of it, but it's a white woman and a woman of color. When the woman of color was in the position, she had to have a graduate degree. The white woman hasn't even completed her college degree. The woman of color, when she had the position, she probably received $20,000 less. This is just off the top of my head from knowing this industry well than a white woman who has not graduated from college receives. Why is that important? Because the average net worth of white women is about $30,000, depending on which study that you're looking at. The average net worth for women of color, in particular African-American women, but as a whole, is either $5 or a negative net worth. If we say we're committed to women's issues, we sure better lean into that targeted universalism and make sure that we're advocating not just pay parity as a whole, because then even when you put all women together, once you add race in, someone mentioned the word intersectionality, you even have worse outcomes. So I sure hope that as we take this information and knowledge, that it's an invitation for us collectively, not to just be here in community. Everybody invites me to be in community. Come on in, come on in. But the reality of it was, I just called a friend of mine today. I said, I'm going into the bank and I'm making a bank deposit. And I said, I guarantee before I leave this bank, I'll be discriminated against. And he said, why do you say that? It happens to me every time I go to the bank. Can you imagine the teller asking you, how did you make this amount of money? Where did you get it from? Could you imagine that? Happens to me every time I go to the bank. And in fact, I had to pay off a large personal loan because it was just, I had to take it for some business deals. And I was asked, going into a business account, coming from my business account, where did I get the money from? I'm asked that every time I go to the bank. Am I sure I earned this money? Why am I bringing this up? Because we talk about everything else. Talking about gender is not easy. That is not my point. My point is that we are more likely to talk about gender and less likely to talk about the particulars of my day-to-day life as both a woman and a person of color. It looks remarkably different. So I had to already get my inner calm before I walked into the branch, knowing that I would be questioned on how I earned my money. And the man next to me, I just have to let this one off my chest. They gave him more respect and he was dealing with $41 as a white male than they gave me with dealing with my payroll and my day-to-day transactions for my own businesses. I can leave it there because I think a piece of the work that we are very comfortable talking about is gender, but we're not comfortable of talking about the intersectionality that comes with that as well.
That brings up a good question. So we talk about allyship, but I mean, had I been standing next to you, how would you like me to help address that, right? If I see that happening,
I think it's an excellent question. And I oftentimes tell people, I just asked about this. I was doing a lecture in partnership with Justice Page last week. And one of the things I talked about was that even Sesame Street is grappling with these issues. So I can lean into Elmo. When you see something, stand up and speak out. So to have some direction for me, I just didn't have the energy for it. I was just like, okay, I already knew it was going to happen. I literally told my friend step by step what was going to happen, got back in the car and confirmed that was exactly what happened. And so it wasn't anything to surprise me or alarm me, but yes, someone feels the need as an ally to speak up and speak out. Maybe that changes the scenario a little bit and also doesn't just put the onus on the same people over and over again. And the reality of it is, a part of the challenge for me, being that English major, just like Carol, we lean into the dictionary, we lean into the real words. I applaud allyship. And when I look at allyship, I look at it as a tool for individuals to do what you're talking about, to maybe stand up, stand out at the bank. But I think we need to go a step further because allyship assumes something very specific. It assumes then that I take some of my privilege and give it to someone else. I think if we really get into the words, I would hope that we can take it one step further and become those abolitionists. We only talk about being an abolitionist related to Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman. But by the very nature of the word of being an abolitionist means that we have to address the entire system and abolish these systems of inequities. Because then it only means, and you're a dear friend of mine, Nadine, so I know you'll understand this. I know you'll speak up and speak out. But what happens when you're not there, Nadine? Because if I would have spoke out what I really wanted to say, I'll tell you the truth, I wouldn't have been here tonight. I would have been in the police station because I would have spoke out and then they would have said, calm down. And then I would have spoke out again and they would have said, stop. and then they would have brought the police, and then I would have started moving, and they'll say, stop resisting. And then club on my head, I'm on the ground. I'm just being honest. So I think a piece of this is allyship is wonderful, but I hope that our real challenge is, and that's why, and literally the irony of it was the person I'm telling this to, this whole story, works for the bank that I was going into. So I said, why is it not that you're not taking this information and then taking it directly to the operations of your bank? It sounds to me, even if someone helped me when I was in line today, that the abolitionist piece of it would have been, their tellers need some training. I can tell you, this bank, I go to all types of locations. Maybe I'm in Edina when I'm running an errand. Maybe I'm in Roseville. Maybe, and it is the exact same thing. So it shows me that there's some commonalities in banking that's happening. And you just saw it on Channel 5 News. A black brother was trying to cash his check, and it was exactly the scenario I gave you. They said, brother, are you sure this is your check? Where did you come from? Usually you people steal. I can tell you exactly how the scenario goes. But then brother escalated, police are called. I just didn't have the energy for it today. So I'm just giving you an example that, yes, we can intercept, which we should, in that allyship mode. But really what needs to happen, in the call that I'm going to make, although my friend who works for the bank did not make this call, I am making a call. Their bank is one of the early adopters of having a chief diversity officer. Yours truly will be calling the chief diversity officer because I'm tired of this. It would be nice if somebody, like I said, is the ally, but truly, fundamentally, something is wrong, and we have to deal with it at the systemic level. Something is wrong with the training. And I'll give you one last example of it. The business banker tells me, looks up my age on the computer, goes, we're about the same age. I'm like, so what? Can you process my deposit? I'm just curious of how you've made this money and built your net worth, and I'm your same age. Where did you get this money from? I said, okay. So you get my point.
Can we, can I just ask the question of what bank? Because this is something that Mary Pence is concerned about in our banking. We've already done a re-looking at how we are spending our money and what we're making money on with our capital. So is that a way to, I mean, truly, we talk about it when we talk about what banks are helping build the oil, right? Or helping build, taking money away from treaty lands or whatever, or causing more problems with water and all that. So how could we, I mean, if it's a bank that we bank with, I would really want to know so that we aren't, so that we could go in there and make a stink, because then we pull the money. That's that's the way to help make change, right? If you're not going to do it, I mean, if they're not going to do it from you asking or from you pointing this out to them, how can we make a movement?
I think that's a wonderful question. I mean, that's really the basis of social change. And it's two key components. And I'll tell you a story. And then, of course, I won't, since I'm being recorded here, I don't want them to retaliate against me. They're my old employer too. How ironic. I'll tell Miss Catherine so you all know. Because I don't know who was in the video. And let me make sure I'm smoothly getting my money and resources out of there, because there's a new Black-owned bank that's coming out of Detroit to Minnesota, and I'm looking for some ways to support them, along with the efforts of Ambassador Andrew Young coming out of Atlanta with the rapper Killer Mike. They're creating a new Black Wall Street bank. So banking is important. So I appreciate this question, Carol, of taking it head on. But here it is, what I really want to say. The greatest power that we have around all the issues, this is the kind of at the center of social change. And I'd have to tell you, Carol, we'd have to close down every grocery store. If you went and lived in my life, I often tell my friends this, they don't believe it, that are not a person of color. I said, if you lived in my life for one day, you'll kill yourself. They said, why? You think this is something going to the bank? Go to the grocery store. Go to the restaurant. I was meeting my publicist and she said, oh, do you want to order food? They never came to take my order. And then she was like, I feel so bad. They asked everybody else around you, but never even looked at you. I was like, don't worry. And then she asked me, she said, well, do you want something as your leave? I said, just forget it. And she was like, well, you've been here an hour and a half. No one acknowledged your presence. Just don't worry. Let's finish this business meeting. And then finally, she pressed me so hard, I told her the truth. I said, that's the same restaurant that wouldn't seat us the last time I was trying to come here for a business meeting with an African-American man. And then when we demanded to be seated, they told us there was no seating in the dining room, and we could clearly see it was open, and sat us in the back corner along the side in the middle of the foot traffic. So that's why I say, and if you don't believe me, Tim Wise studied this in when he redid that book around Black Like Me, in that sense of what was it like for identity of being Black. And he said it based upon his research that the vast majority of Caucasians would kill themselves if they had to be Black for one day. So it's not just the bank, it's everything. I can tell you it's everything. Whether I'm going to the store to buy clothes, it's like, can I see in your bag? And I mean, my mother got harassed last time we were at Macy's, it was done. The lady told us, because I was returning a suit, the women's section, and there was not an associate in there. You know, Macy's, they don't even write name tags. You can't figure out what they're doing anymore. So I went to the next section over there, Eileen Fisher. The lady tells me, you people need to learn to go to the right department if you're going to make a return. After I watched her do returns and purchase for everyone else that was in front of us. So mother thought I was going to let it go, but she forgot hush child. I said, can you bring your manager here, ma'am, so we can talk to your manager about this? And I told her in front of the manager, I said, if I wanted to, I could buy this whole collection of clothing at Eileen Fisher. It's not my style, but if I wanted to, if that's the point you're trying to make. But the reality of it was she had disrespected my mother, so we had to call it out and do that stand up and stand in. Wish we had some allies there that day, because it looked like I created the problem, but really the problem was the associate. The manager apologized, the associate never did, but that's the reality, what I'm talking about day to day, because these things are systemic. So here's a story I want to tell you from Ghana to give us a sense about how we can build and sustain social change. I was in the slave castle in Cape Coast, and I met a young man who was also a civil rights advocate and activist. And he was talking about all the issues in Alabama. I was like, you think you're talking about something in Alabama? Because everyone thinks it's the South. I was like, Minnesota is the Jim Crow of the North. Are you kidding me? Every quality of life indicator humanly possible, we are failing on. From healthcare to education to home ownership, the lowest of the low. And we are competing at the bottom, and if you think it's a Southern challenge, with Alabama and Mississippi. If you don't believe me, post the murder of Mr. Floyd, NPR did a special on it, documented every quality of life indicator in Minnesota is squarely at the bottom. Yet we're one of the states with some of the highest concentrations of millionaires, best school systems. We've even reached the rank of one of the happiest places to live, and I've never experienced it. I was born and raised here. Yet with all those things coupled together, we still had some challenges. So the gentleman from Alabama, he never believed me, but I hope he went home and did his homework. But then I saw out the window, I kept looking at the courtyard. So, you know, we're upstairs because the slave dungeons are on the base level. But the slave masters made sure that they had these big, open, luxurious pieces that they were able to look down the courtyard. And you want to talk about women's issues, so they could have a keen eye to select the woman that they were going to rape and violate that evening. So as I looked down the courtyard, now I'll take us to the happier note of this. There was a gentleman that I saw. Remember, I said I'm from a family of pastors and teachers. So I said, that's what Jesus looks like. And the young man is like, what are you talking about? I'm like, that man down there in the courtyard is what Jesus looks like. And he looked closer. He still didn't get it. I was like, don't you see those locks and the shea butter? His skin was just glistening, beautiful white linen outfit. I said, that's what Jesus looks like. We have to get outside to see Black Jesus. He was still perplexed. But I was like, something about that man in that courtyard, I'm supposed to meet him. So we rushed out to the courtyard, and I almost called him Black Jesus, but that might have been a little startling. I let it go. So we rushed out the courtyard to meet this man I knew I was supposed to meet. And the gentleman from Alabama says, yes, we came to talk to you. She said we needed to talk to you. And, you know, you have to help us. In Alabama, we have gun violence. We have education disparities. We have this challenge. He's going on a long list. And BJ, as I fondly call him now, just listened and smiled and nodded. He went through this long list, my brother from Alabama. And then BJ responds. And he says, I have two words for you: divest and invest. And at first I was like, what are you talking about? We were looking for some real answers to some real issues. You give 2 words and walk off. My brother from Alabama was like, unacceptable. We want more information. So he follows back up to, what do you mean? And he says, well, here you are in Ghana. And if you lived here, and even if you lived in the US, you'll rush to buy a Mercedes or a Jaguar or all these other cars. Why would you not buy a Katum, a car that was built and made right here in Ghana? You will rush around. He changed even my lifestyle about clothing. I would break my neck on my lunch break to make it to Brooks Brothers to get the best price on a suit. He was like, why don't you wear our cultural clothing? Never had thought about it. He talked about how truly, if we cultivated the power of the African diaspora, 1.4 billion strong, the impact that we could have on culture, on economics, on impact as a whole. And that is not because then people get uptight. Is she a Black nationalist? No, I am not. I'm talking about the power of culture. I'm talking about what Carol is talking about economics, but more importantly, about consciousness. So here he is telling us to divest and invest. So Carol, that's the message that I have for you. How do we divest and invest in the areas where we know that we can create change as our investment side? And where do we divest, going back to Nadine, in the areas where we know folks are not being accountable to equity around gender, around race? Fill in the blank of the issues that you're passionate about and align your money, your gifts, and talents related to it. Like, for instance, I have a whole new wardrobe. I've worn their dresses all over the place now. There's a company called Zuri, Z-U-R-I, a fair trade company that's doing work in Kenya. I found them on a link related to Global Mamas. And when I found them, it spoke to me because I said they're helping to create some jobs for people that don't have access to jobs the same way you and I might. So why would I not wear the clothing that they've created and help to support the work in real time? So the message, of course, for social change and movement building is divest and invest. And Carol, I was just kidding. I don't care about saying names aloud. U.S. Bank. I'll say it loud and proud. U.S. Bank. But it's not just U.S. Bank. I can tell you about every bank that I've walked into and almost got knocked down anyway. So part of this is making sure across the board that we have training to challenge around bias in real time. That should be something universal for banking. I should not have to come in and justify how much money I have in my account, where I got it from. I mean, next time I'll make a little light of it based upon the stereotypes. I'm determined. I'm going to tell them I'm a rapper and I got it from selling drugs. See how that goes for me. But in all seriousness, we shouldn't have to do this type of foolishness. So I'm just saying it, U.S. Bank, I'll say it loud and strong, we'll be writing a letter. But in addition to that, divest and invest is a widespread strategy that we should be using and asking questions. The same way, in many ways, follow the money related to a company, for instance, like Global Tel Link. Global Tel Link wants you to think that that's a nice, fancy name. But Global Tel Link overseas is one of those top 3 to 5 that oversee the prison phone call process and control prison phone call rates. When Global Tel Link and Securus are able to charge between $1 to $5 a minute, we know something is wrong. And we know that there are privately traded companies. Who is overseeing them? What other businesses do they own? For instance, Global Tel Link also owns Potbelly. What are all the connections between all these businesses and where our money goes without any accountability? These are real issues. So in my investment processes, I make sure that I ask some key questions. Where is my portfolio invested? What do I need to consider? Because it sounds real nice. Let me give you another hint from Sarah's piece about civic engagement. Sounds real sweet. Core Civics. Core Civics sounds wonderful. I could have named my company that. Core Civics is privately traded prisons. We have to challenge and ask some questions. Their profit margin is off the backs of my brothers and sisters who are behind bars and in chains. So I think a part of what I'm really saying here in response to Carol's question, do your homework, my friends. And to Nadine's piece, be those allies, but bring your pocketbook with you. And at the same time, make sure that we're not just sharing privilege with each other. Because for instance, we're here in America, we're here in Minnesota. Yes, I need allies. But if you are going to Ghana with me, you need me as an ally to navigate culture, tradition, to understand. But that's not what I want. I don't even want it, because sometimes people think, oh, well, if you had more power, how would you feel? We get all wrapped up in these race questions that make zero sense. What I want in the beauty of Ghana, and I've seen it in real time, because many times my friends who are Caucasian ask, can I go to Africa with you? I'm like, I don't even know why you're asking me this question. Because first of all, Africa's home to us all. That's where we all came from. Science teaches us that. But more importantly, the things that we do in America to each other related to race, related to all the discriminatory practices, that's not the same default that happens in Ghana. In fact, the first word that you will see when you enter the airport in Ghana, the first word that you see when you're leaving out the slave castles is Aquaba, which means you are welcome. It doesn't say Aquaba black folks, Aquaba those who represent the continent. It's for everyone. So I think in many ways, there are some lessons that we can learn about humanity. And one last thing, since I'm talking about Ghana, one of the things that I love with Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, he was the first prime minister of Ghana. One of the things that he talked about, now he could have said, hey, we hate the British, those colonizers. He didn't even mention any of those things because he knew that it was important to transition power with no bloodshed and to keep everyone safe and whole. Because if he had started off an unstable situation, how do you undo it? It's impossible. But here it is. This piece relates to Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. He gave everyone a sense that it wasn't about where you came from, if you were the Ga people, or if you came from the Ashantis. He talked about one thing, and I hope America, this is my dream for America, that we get here, that we're all Ghanaians, that we're all one. He talked about it's no longer related to tribal markings, for instance, on your face, or by some of the markings that you'd have on your body, that we are one people. And that's what I'm after. And I believe, and my hunch is, that's why I love the work of Mary's Pence, I believe women will lead the way. Because if we look at the research of what we learn about women in leadership, there's one common theme, that everyone wants the qualities of women in leadership, but they don't want us in leadership when we're talking about our male counterparts. They all say across the board, we are the best problem solver. We're intuitive. We help to be able to be more empathetic in the workplace, more compassion. But yet they'll say, and that's why Sheryl Sandberg called it out, yet they'll say when we do that, then we're not acting like a boss. But yet the data shows, and if you don't believe me, look at the research from the Athena doctrine. It's a whole body of research that everybody wants the qualities that women bring to the workplace, but they don't want the woman to bring her with it. And thank you for the book recommendations. Thank you for all the resources. I'm grateful to be here tonight. We covered a lot of ground, and you never know, with me, it's the unexpected. But please speak up and speak out. When you see something, speak up and speak out. It is happening all the time. I just wish I could give you all a black face and you could walk with me through this world. You would not look at every place that you go to on a day-to-day basis the same way.
Well, we're grateful you were here with us tonight. Also, you gave us a lot to think about and many good perspectives and a lot of information and facts. So we'll carry that forward, and we're just so appreciative that you could spend time with us tonight.